Hello and welcome to the program. I am Adeshewa Josh. It's time to take you through major headlines around the world. And we will start with the story of two journalists shot dead in Afghanistan. Actually, they work for the Associated Press news agency. They were shot dead by a police officer in eastern Afghanistan. One of the women died in the attack, and her colleague Kathy Gannon is reported to be stable. This comes as Afghanistan intensifies security ahead of presidential elections tomorrow in response to threats of violence by the Taliban.
Despite the high security in preparation for tomorrow's elections, one journalist met her maker today, while another got lucky. A man dressed as a police shot two foreign journalists in eastern Afghanistan, killing one and critically wounding the other. Taliban insurgents have pledged to disrupt the polls through a campaign of bombings and assassinations. The recent violence has left some Kabul residents worried about heading to the polls. Despite security concerns, other residents said the recent attacks will not prevent them from casting their votes. President Hamid Karzai, who's led Afghanistan for more than 12 years since the fall of the Taliban, is constitutionally barred from seeking another term in office. At the moment, there are 8 contenders battling it out in Afghanistan's presidential elections. But political observers have pinpointed 3 which they say are the most likely to win. Former Foreign Minister Zalmay Rasool has been one of the closest confidants of incumbent President Hamid Karzai. To win, a candidate must secure more than 50% of valid ballots, failing which the top 2 candidates go into a runoff. There are nearly 28,500 polling centers and smaller polling stations, and at least 10% of polling stations are expected to be closed due to security threats. Polling stations will open at 7 a.m. local time tomorrow and close at 4 p.m. on April the 5th. But some could remain open for 2 hours longer, depending on the number of voters.
A court in India has sentenced 3 men to death by hanging, and this comes under a new law which carries the death penalty for those convicted of multiple sexual assaults. The men were convicted of raping a photojournalist in Mumbai last year, but they were also among 5 men sentenced to life in jail last month for raping another woman in a separate incident in the city. The 3 men are the first to be tried and convicted under the tough new law aimed at punishing repeat sexual offenders. Search teams began using a towed ping locator to hunt for the black box of missing Malaysia Airlines flight MH370. 2 ships with locator capabilities are searching a 240 kilometers underwater path in the hope of recovering the plane's data recorder. The plane disappeared on the 8th of March en route from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. It was carrying 239 people. Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan is not a happy man as we speak, and that's because a court in his country has lifted a ban on Twitter. The court ruled that the 2-week-old ban must be lifted as it is a breach of freedom of expression. Mr. Erdogan, who criticized the ruling, said his government had complied with it, but that he did not respect the decision. He had vowed to wipe out Twitter after users spread corruption allegations. In a related development, Turkish media reported today that a court ruling has ordered the lifting of a similar ban on YouTube. The ruling reportedly stated that 15 videos should remain blocked. Users across the country had found many ways of circumventing the prohibitions, which were widely criticized and ridiculed. And now, as the world continues to search for a solution to the Middle East crisis, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry says it is time for a reality check in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Now, he was speaking in Morocco, and Mr. Kerry said there are limits to the time Washington would expend on trying to get the sides to reach an agreement. He spoke after drastic steps were taken by Israel and the Palestinians in the past 2 days, with each side accusing one another of violating previous promises. Now, talks are meant to conclude next month. Mr. Kerry has shuttled backwards and forwards for negotiations with Israel and the Palestinians in recent weeks. However, Washington has expressed exasperation at what it calls unhelpful unilateral actions taken by both sides. Now let's move on to the story. An argument with another soldier or a group of soldiers may have prompted the shooting at an army base in Texas. Now that's according to U.S. Army officials who formally identified the attacker as 34-year-old specialist Evan Lopez. Lopez also killed himself after shooting and killing 3 of his colleagues. The Army says there is very strong evidence that the gunman, originally from Puerto Rico, had an unstable psychological condition. Officials have also said that Lopez had served in Iraq and was being assessed for post-traumatic stress disorder. 16 others were wounded in the attack. Now, Greg Flakos, our colleague at the Voice of America, joins us live from Texas to talk more about this matter. Greg, you're welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I'm very pleased to be here.
Now, tell us, what else do we know about this shooting?
Well, as you already mentioned, we know that he is or was a mentally disturbed person. We know that he joined the Army in 2008 for about 4 months in Iraq, but did not see combat as far as we know. But he was still a specialist, very low rank in the Army. So right there, there's some indication of something not working there. But many people who knew him, including neighbors, said that he was friendly, seemed like a nice guy, a family man. There was no indication that he would have a violent outbreak like this.
Okay, because there are lots of speculations that he has some sort of post-traumatic stress disorder. What else do you know about this man? Is this likely to be true? And are the authorities considering this in, following up on the matter?
Well, he had asked to be treated for post-traumatic stress disorder, but as I mentioned, he'd only been in Iraq 4 months and he was driving a truck. As far as we know, he hadn't been a witness to anything too terrible. Normally, people who have that condition are people who have been in intense combat situations or who have witnessed terrible things like bombings where perhaps some of their fellow soldiers were torn apart or something like that, something very stressful. He had not been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder yet. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't have at some point had he continued it, but at least as far as things stood at the moment that he died and unfortunately took other lives, he had not been formally declared to have that disorder, but he had been diagnosed with other problems, including depression and also an inability to get adequate sleep. And of course, not getting enough sleep can cause mental problems as well. Unfortunately, also the medicine he was prescribed, Ambien, has in some rare cases been associated with people having aggressive behavior or sleepwalking, even sleep driving or binge eating at night while asleep. But this was something that was carried out in broad daylight on an afternoon when presumably that medicine wouldn't have been in his system if he'd been taking it the night before. So there are a lot of questions that we can't answer right now. Perhaps an autopsy will reveal more. It might reveal, for example, that he had taken some other drugs or had alcohol or something that could have interfered with the medicine.
Okay, let me ask you this last question. How do you see prosecutors follow up on this? Because now Ivan is dead.
Well, in this case, there won't be any prosecution because, as you mentioned, the shooter is dead. He took his own life. So the only legal ramifications might be if at some point something is revealed that somebody perhaps gave him the wrong medicine, or perhaps that the gun he used was sold illegally. Although right now, from what we know, it wasn't. It was purchased legally. He illegally brought it onto the fort campus because if you have a gun, you're supposed to register it, and the fort authorities are supposed to know about it, and evidently they didn't. In this case, he bought a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol. And that's one of the controversies also, because in this country, you can, in a place like Texas, as an average citizen, you can go to a store and buy a weapon like that. That is something that is restricted more in other states, but Texas is a bit more open about that sort of thing. And military people are presumed to have had training and know how to handle a weapon. But in this case, of course, the results were quite tragic.
All right, Greg, lastly, the people around that Fort Hood will still be in shock. Is that still the situation? How are they reacting, and how is everyone protecting themselves?
Well, of course, it has to be mentioned that this is not the first time this has happened at Fort Hood. In 2009, there was a terrible attack by Major Nidal Hassan, who brought, I believe, more than one pistol to the campus and fired and killed 13 people and wounded many more. I think it was around 30. Some of those people are still alive, but they've suffered from disabilities associated with that shooting. So obviously people there are on edge and worried about why these things are happening there at that fort. It is the largest U.S. military fort, takes up a big portion of central Texas, a very sprawling area. So given the population, given the fact that you have so many people returning from combat there, to some extent you might expect some of these things, but critics of the mental health system in the military say that perhaps more should be done for people like this, and they should be more encouraged to seek help, because many of them don't, because they feel that it will hurt their career if they are receiving mental health treatment.
Yeah, all right. I agree with you totally on that one, Greg. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that matter. Thanks a lot, Greg. I've been speaking to Greg Flakers, our colleague from The Voice of America.